This is slide 2 of our 60s Vietnam unit on Vietnam expansion. As the war continued to grow, more and more soldiers were needed, so more and more soldiers were drafted. And the longer the war went, the more unpopular the war became. And a lot of young men responded by protesting the draft and burning their draft cards. You got a draft card in the mail informing you that your number had been chosen and you had to report for duty. So a lot of young men decided they were going to protest the war by burning their draft cards. You see the picture down here of the guy holding a burning draft card there. These people were known as draft dodgers. They were dodging the draft. Now, because they had essentially committed a federal crime by refusing a court order to appear for military service, they had to leave the country. So most of them went to Canada. Close, English-speaking, very similar culture, so it's not all that different from living in the U.S. But these draft dodgers would have to leave the country because they had committed a crime. Most go to Canada and will stay there, many of them. Eventually, President Carter will pardon the draft dodgers, but that's not until we get into the mid-70s. So draft dodgers forfeited their lives, basically, citizenship here, rather than go to war. Okay. Now, as the war becomes more and more unpopular and the protesters become more and more powerful, the government turns the CIA onto its own citizens. The CIA is used to spy on the anti-war movement, the draft protesters. Protest leaders had their phones tapped, their movements followed, their mail opened, FBI cases built against them, hopefully to lock them up, to get them out of the way, to do something with them, because they were causing the government more and more problems. Now, one of the protesters' arguments here is that they believe the government is not telling them the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Turns out they were right. And we find that out in January 1968 during what's known as the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive. Okay. This is a major offensive push in the war by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. If you see the map up here in the corner, the Tet Offensive, all these little dots here are places where North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong attacks were all held at the same time. These are coordinated attacks. It's launched on the Vietnamese New Year, New Year's Day, which is called Tet. That's where it gets the nickname the Tet Offensive, because it's launched on Vietnamese New Year, or Tet. Now, why this is such a big deal? The United States actually ends up winning most of these battles. It's a military loss for North Vietnam. But the problem is that the United States government had been telling the people, the war is almost over. Our boys will be home soon. We've just about defeated the enemy, blah, 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 and all of that. And then suddenly the enemy launches all these attacks in South Vietnam. If an enemy can pull this off, coordinate this many attacks all at once, that's clearly not an enemy that's almost defeated. It became very clear to the American public that the government was lying to them about how the war was going. Now again, this is January 68, and we're going to have sorry, went blank there. Presidential election, sorry. We're going to have a presidential election in that fall, November of 68. And this will be the undoing of President Johnson. Okay? Little spoiler alert here. He'll lose. He's not even going to run. And our new president will be Richard Nixon. And one of Nixon's first priorities is something called Vietnamization. Okay? Vietnamization. This is Nixon's plan to gradually withdraw troops from Vietnam and turn over more and more control of the war to South Vietnam, to let them start fighting their own war a little more than we've been. So gradually withdraw troops and turn over more control to South Vietnam. Okay? Now, the war was not only unpopular here at home, it was extremely unpopular with soldiers in Vietnam itself. American soldiers, particularly draftees, were getting more and more frustrated with their commanding officers, and they began to kill their own commanding officers. It was known as fragging. Right? They would use fragmentation grenades. These are grenades that when they explode, they spread shrapnel everywhere. So they would explode these fragmentation grenades near their own officers to kill them, because they believed these officers they were getting, fresh out of school here, no military actual combat experience, were getting them killed. So the war is not only unpopular here at home, it's very unpopular with the soldiers in Vietnam itself. And they expressed their displeasure by killing their own officers. Right? Now, we need to take a moment here and talk about chemical warfare. This is nasty. It's just very, very nasty stuff. The United States is responsible for using chemical warfare on our enemies in North and South Vietnam. The most well-known of them is called napalm. Okay. Very famous quote in the movie Apocalypse Now. Great Vietnam movie if you haven't seen it. Love the smell of napalm in the morning. Ugh. Right? Napalm is a particularly nasty chemical. It's almost a gel-like substance. It's got sort of the, if you know what liquid cement is, like glue that you kind of brush on, it's like that. It's gooey, gel-like, sticky substance. It's made of all sorts of things, but it has in it, among flammable liquids, it also has a white phosphorus, an acid in it. And it can be dropped from bombs, it can be sprayed with flamethrowers, it catches fire, but it also burns like the acid. Now the problem with napalm is, if you're the guy that it ends up on, that the acid in it starts to burn through your skin. Because it's a gel-like substance, let's say a blob of napalm lands on your arm, on your skin, okay? And the acid, when it comes into contact with you, starts to burn and eat through your skin. So your first instinct is to wipe it off. But all that does is smear the gel all over your arm. So now instead of one little spot, your whole arm is burning. And because you've used your bare hand to try to wipe it off, your hand is now burning. And because it's a gel substance, water won't wash it off. It essentially has to just burn itself out, and that takes a long time. Napalm is some nasty, nasty stuff. Okay? We also use a couple other types of chemicals here. One, called Agent Orange, is meant to destroy the foliage, the vegetation of Vietnam. One of the problems we had was finding the enemy. Vietnam is very thick jungle, mountainous jungle territory, and a very thick, heavy canopy of trees. So the enemy would hide under the trees there, and we couldn't spot them from helicopters or planes. Okay? So we had a thought, well, what if we destroyed the foliage here, killed the trees and the leaves? So we would use planes to spray the jungle on these plants. Well, this compound, this chemical agent, would not only hit the plants, it would, fall down onto the ground, and it'd seep into the water underground, and it would seep into streams and lakes and things. And not only the enemy had to walk through the jungles, we did too, and we would brush up against these leaves and trees that had this chemical on it. Well, the problem is this chemical that they're using to destroy the vegetation is also very harmful to humans. Right? It causes boils on the skin, and it eventually does chromosome damage. It will cause cancer long term, we find out. And a lot of U.S. soldiers end up contracting Agent Orange. They would come home, and they would have these horrible almost diseases. I can remember as a young boy, my cousins lived next door, and as a little boy, 4, 5, 6 years old, my cousin had served in Vietnam. And I remember his skin was always very bright red, and he had these big sores, boils on his face and his arms, and they would pop open and pus would drain out of them. I can remember as a little kid always being scared of him because he looked very scary to me. He had contracted Agent Orange, and he lived with this the rest of his life. Okay? So we do a lot of damage to our own soldiers as well as the enemy. Last one is called Agent Blue, and this one, we don't think things through very often. Agent Blue was meant to destroy the food supply of the enemy. We would spray the rice fields, these rice paddies of the enemy, and just we're just going to starve them out. We'll destroy all their food. Well, again, the problem is our soldiers have to walk through these flooded rice fields, and our soldiers will contract diseases from this chemical as much or more than the enemy will. So chemical warfare is not only nasty on the enemy, it doesn't do our own soldiers much good either. Okay, last couple of things here. There's a very famous incident we need to talk about known as the My Lai Massacre. My Lai, that's how that's pronounced. The Viet Cong would practice guerrilla warfare. They would work in very small groups of, 8 to 10 soldiers, use hit-and-run tactics. They would attack us and then disappear into the jungle real quickly. And because they knew the terrain, they knew the jungle, and there's so small groups of them, it was very hard for soldiers to find them. So, we'd get a hit, we'd chase them, and then we'd lose them. Well, there is one instance of a small South Vietnamese village. This is South Vietnam. We're helping them, right? That's why we're there. This is in 1970, a small village of in South Vietnam. U.S. troops followed some Viet Cong through the jungle and chased them until we come upon this village of My Lai. And the Viet Cong had simply disappeared. We lost them. It is at that point that the commanding officer, a man named Lieutenant William Calley, apparently just snapped. He lost it. He was so frustrated. He lost it, and he decides that he's had enough. And he turns his soldiers loose on the villagers of My Lai. Now again, this is South Vietnam. These are the people we're supposed to be there protecting. Calley and his troops will murder 350 South Vietnamese villagers in My Lai. Women, children, elderly, young. They try to hide the fact that this happened, covered up. And they do for almost 2 years, until eventually some soldiers talk. Here you see the headlines there. First photos of Viet mass slaying, and the people of My Lai. This is definitely another one of those not so bright shining moments in our history. Right? Okay, let's turn our attention here next to Cambodia. Okay. As you see in the map, Cambodia borders much of South Vietnam here. Okay? And what was happening was the Viet Cong would hold bases along the border here in Cambodia, and they would run into South Vietnam, attack U.S. troops, and then run back into Cambodia. Well, President Nixon, who wins in November '68, Nixon decides he's had enough of this, and he orders the bombing of Viet Cong bases in Cambodia. Now, the problem is Cambodia is not in the war. They are a neutral third country. Okay? Now, they're not chasing out the Viet Cong, but they're also not helping them. They're not involved in the war. You can't simply go around bombing countries that aren't involved in a war. Nixon's justification is, if that's where the enemy is, that's where I'm going to get him. Okay? So the bombing of or of Cambodia proves very, very, very controversial for Nixon. Will turn public opinion greatly against him. Okay? All right. Lastly, the 16th, or sorry, going way back there, 26th Amendment. The 26th Amendment will lower the voting age to 18, from 21 to 18. The argument being that if you are old enough to be drafted at 18 and go fight in a war, you're old enough to have a say in the people that are sending you there. So this is passed in 1971 and will lower the voting age to 18, which was the draft age. Okay. All right, we've got one slide left here to wind up the Vietnam War.